Thank you, Allison. And so with that, without further ado, I'm so excited to welcome you all to our first session today with Leah, Jamie, and Dennis. Thank you all so much for joining us. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Leah.
Morning. My name is Leah Farnham. She, her pronouns. I'm a partner at the Bridgeband Group. We are a nonprofit advisor to mission-driven organizations and philanthropists. I am delighted to be joined by Dennis Quirin from the Rakes Foundation and Jamie Coppell from the Communities for Just Schools Fund. Last week, we did this session in person in Chicago in the wake of the Buffalo Massacre. Today, we do it again in the wake of the Robb Elementary School Massacre. And gosh, already I'm emotional. And for those of you who know me, that's not unusual. But I would love to just start by taking a moment quiet of silence, check in with yourself. We are about to engage in the topic of systems change, and I'm so thrilled, and it's a privilege to get to have this conversation and to get to have it with Dennis and Jamie. But before we go there, let's just take a minute, and then I will encourage you all to show up as you are in this moment, engage as you can in this conversation, and we welcome you as you are. Well, my first official talking point is in this multi-crisis dynamic context, there is an urgent need for systems change and an urgent opportunity to reimagine and reinvest in equitable systems that support healthy, just, thriving, equitable societies. And as I said last week, that feels like an understatement. But we're here to explore that idea, explore what it takes, and really talk about how massive systemic change happens and who makes it happen. And as you saw in the title for today, we want to focus on these unique organizations that are effectively addressing population level change. We use the term field catalysts. We also love the metaphor of nerve centers, anchor organizations, systems orchestrators, lots of terms that are being used to describe these critical leaders and organizers of the collective work of equitable systems change. We will have a Slido open for this discussion. I know, thank you, many of you for already putting your introductions into the chat. That was also our first Slido, so I think, Jen, we can skip that one. And let me skip to the next poll to warm up the Slido, which is, systems change is in so many conference headlines and news headlines and inside philanthropy every day when I open that newsletter, systems change is a topic. And so I'd love to start with this poll to hear from you all. Where is your grant-making institution vis-a-vis the notion of systems change? For those of you familiar with Slido, you can just go to slido.com and type in, as you see on the left-hand side there, our poll number or our session number. If you want to use your phone, you can also just hold your phone up to that QR code and it should take you right there. And we'll use a couple polls throughout. There's also a Q&A function, which we can reference and enable upvoting later on in this session. Let's take a moment and have you all pop into that first poll. All right, looks like majority of you see system change as core to who you are and the impact that you seek as an organization. Some of you are in this category of doing some grant making focus on systems change work, but maybe it's not the centerpiece of your approach. And some of you, as I said, keep hearing about systems change and you're here to learn more. Welcome, thanks for being here. In terms of structure for this session, we will start with a brief overview of the research we've been doing at Bridgespan on this notion of equitable field building towards system change and the unique role that field catalysts play. Then we'll have a conversation with Dennis and Jamie from their roles as grant maker, grantee, and we'll save a significant portion of the time for Q&A towards the latter half. So we have a few curated questions, and then we'll turn to you all to hear what's top of mind for you. So let me start with some framing and a brief, very brief overview of our research as we kick off our time today. At Bridgespan, as I mentioned, we are working toward societies characterized by equity and justice. That's our mission. And over now 20 years in existence, it is so clear, and it's become clearer and clearer, that our biggest social and environmental problems are systemic. Inequities in education and health and criminal justice, these are systems comprised of people and organizations and institutions, norms, incentives, beliefs, policies, and they're not achieving positive, equitable outcomes. And in fact, they were designed for the inequity that we see. And over the past few years, as we've studied dozens of systems change efforts, we see this unique and often unseen type of nonprofit organization that is working to completely transform these inequitably designed systems. Again, we call them field catalysts. We love the metaphor of nerve centers, but these nerve center-like entities truly make the whole greater than the sum of parts. And as you look at these logos, these are many of the organizations that we've studied, you may not recognize many of them. That's because they are often working behind the scenes to harmonize and galvanize the work of others. We sometimes refer to this collective work as field building, this idea that a set of individuals and organizations is working to address a common social issue or problem, often using and building a shared knowledge base together. And we see that these field catalysts play three really critical roles in these field building efforts. Firstly, they diagnose and assess the field and really seek to truly understand from every possible facet and angle, what is the problem that we're solving together? They connect and organize the field. One interviewee said, we work in the space in between other organizations, so that we often use these like physiological or anatomical metaphors, the nerve center, but the connective tissue. So working at that space in between other leaders, connecting dots, connecting organizations, supporting relationship building across the field. And then third, advocating for the field, often through their own platforms or megaphones, and often by amplifying the voices and the work of their partners in the field. So as we started to see that there are these behind the scenes, again, often unseen organizations leading these systems change efforts, we really wanted to understand what do they bring, how do they do it? What are their superpowers? What are their assets? And so in our research last year, really studied the superpowers of these organizations and saw four common threads. First, it's this ability to get to, as I said earlier, this deep understanding of the problem and ecosystem, but also the flip side of that coin, which is developing a vision and creating alignment around that vision for equitable and durable systems change that leads to population level results. This understanding of the problem and the vision is developed with myriad actors and groups and communities. Importantly, it's not about the field catalyst defining its own agenda, but rather holding the field's agenda and vision. And a point of emphasis here from our research that a pitfall of some past systems change efforts we've studied has been a vision or work that does not explicitly put equity at the center, and has led to often exclusive or perceived exclusive field building efforts that left out key groups. And those left out have often been those most impacted by the field, by the problem and the problem that the field is trying to solve. So if we actually were to focus on those least well served today, or perhaps most marginalized or even oppressed by these systems, well, we may actually move toward the equitable systems change needed to achieve truly population level results. The third asset is an organizer's mindset. Field catalysts are organized, and they're organizers. They have fluid ways of learning and evolving. They see the various roles and assets across the ecosystem. They help other groups align and work in concert. They provide coordination. They harmonize. And then this fourth superpower in the lime green here really charges and fuels the other three. And that is this notion of holding and building trusting relationships and credibility with the leaders and groups required to achieve change. We heard in almost every interview, it felt like this idea that this work happens at the speed of trusting relationships. And so, gosh, looking at these superpowers, this is not a current, view of how funders do due diligence, right? These are different types of assets. These are different capabilities and competencies. And this work is messy and complex. And we know that in general in philanthropy, we favor short-term projects with clear, measurable results. As one field catalyst leader we spoke to said, fundraising for this emergent work is not straightforward. By the time you package it, it's iterated and changed already. And yet that's what makes it effective. But that's what makes it just so challenging to fundraise for. These organizations are different animals behind the scenes, connecting and amplifying others' work. And yet, we do need funders to be investing in these organizations. We do need to see and find and fund this important work. And so in our research, we're tied to many of the big ideas in the field right now, are really seeking to understand what is that new paradigm in philanthropy. I'd offer a couple insights from the folks that we interviewed, encouragements perhaps. The first is this idea of moving from funder-driven diagnoses to that field-led, field-born vision and shared understanding that really is shaped and affirmed by those doing the work, those affected by the systems that we're looking to upend and transform, those with proximity to the problem. And also moving from what can feel like transactional relationships between funders and grantees to more intentional partnerships. Here I do like to call NCRP into the room as well in the Power Moves framework, because that Power Moves framework has sharing power and building power and wielding power. And we heard from these field catalyst leaders that, look, philanthropy and funders have power, and we need that power to be wielded to help us get a seat at tables that we don't have, to provide, of course, the funding and capital, to help organize other funders against this work. But there's that notion of partnership and funders as partners is really core to the success of these organizations as well. So I hope this has piqued your interest. A whirlwind quick tour through some of the headlines from our research, but I'm really eager to get into conversation with Dennis and Jamie to animate this, to really hear what this looks like, to fund this type of work as a funder, and why that's hard, and why that's so promising, and what it takes. Hear from Jamie about what it really looks like to do this work in action. And so before we, or as we transition to chat with Dennis and Jamie, would love to open up the Slido again and pause for a moment and hear from you all. What organizations came to mind as I was describing this often behind the scenes work of Field Catalyst, what funders come to mind who are boldly moving into these types of new approaches? So feel free to, again, on your phone with the QR code, or go to slido.com and enter in 2155770 for the next poll. Yes, thank you. Some of the same names we saw last week as well. Board, PolicyLink, California Endowment. Awesome. Thank you all. Feel free, as other organizations and funders come to mind, to pop them into that poll. And Dennis and Jamie, I will turn to you now. And I will say, in our prep call for this conversation in front of the room last week, I really do feel so privileged to know you both, to get to have this conversation with you. You are doing the real hard work that I get to research and advise, and I'm so grateful that you're here to really illuminate and animate and make concrete this work. That one of our problems is actually a communication problem. I say all these things and it's like, but what exactly does that look like in the real world as a funder, as a Field Catalyst? What does it look like? And so for you all in the audience, in our prep call, we agreed that this conversation would be most beneficial to all of us if we approach it with candor and vulnerability and humility and curiosity. So we're eager to get into the real work and the tough issues, and ask that each of you approach this with the same principles. So Jamie is the co-director of the Communities for Just Schools Fund. Dennis is the executive director of the Rakes Foundation and a funder of CJSF and several other nerve center-like organizations. And Jamie, I'll start with you. CJSF, as I said, exemplifies so many of the roles and assets of Field Catalyst. You do the systems change work. So would love for you to start by telling us more about what you do. Help us demystify this often unseen work, and any stories or examples from the past few years would be lovely. Thank you and welcome, Jamie.
Thanks so much, Leah. And thank you for encouraging us all to take a breath as we got started. I know when we got on the line this morning, I said, I feel stretched. I feel shaky. I really don't feel like I want to feel today. And so I just encourage us all to hold that that's okay. In fact, it's important. So thank you, Leah, for grounding us there and for this invitation. This is where I want to be in this moment with you, with Dennis, with our friends and family at GEO, and with everyone who's joined us today. So I'm grateful, and I ask for your grace if I'm shaky or stretched during this conversation. I know you all understand why. So to answer your question, Leah, with gratitude for it, CJSF, Communities for Just Schools Fund, is a collaborative. We exist to provide resources to grassroots organizations, to grassroots organizers who are working for racial justice in education. We're in our 12th year, and we were started by people in philanthropy who really fundamentally understood that in the ecosystem of education justice, grassroots organizers are the most impactful and the most likely to be invisibilized or erased from the stories of progress and success. And we're part of an arc that began with Black mothers on the ground in Mississippi who were the first to name the existence of the schoolhouse to jailhouse track, because they knew and needed to name for themselves and their communities what they could see, which was this kind of pervasive system of racial hierarchy that was eating up their children. And that was the birth of a movement to end the school to prison pipeline and to change school as we know it and as it has always been in this nation. And thanks to that movement, public will began to shift, and the things that we in philanthropy like to measure started to change. Suspensions and expulsions decreased. There was a general understanding of the racial disparities that existed in those data. And this all happened, but this is not how we always tell the story, because of organizers' demands, because of their insistence. Even though, as we have seen that success, as this movement has continued to grow and to demand the resources that it needs to flourish, new threats are invented, and new obstacles to the emotional and physical safety of Black, Indigenous, Brown, LGBTQ young folks in schools continue to be introduced. And this is a moment where I will name Robb Elementary. I will name what happened yesterday in Texas, because the reality is that as this nation reckons with its failure to pass gun control in a meaningful way, and all of these things that of course are captivating the headlines even today and even yesterday, what is a line below those headlines are the comments of folks like the Attorney General in Texas, who 90 minutes after this tragedy happened said, let's arm teachers. He dusted off a handbook he already had at his disposal. He said, let's arm teachers. Let's do more target hardening in schools. And what I will say to you is those are threats for all of us, but they are in particular threats to the wellness, to the sense of belonging of Black and Brown young folks in schools around this nation, because those are things that are used to criminalize them, to target them, and they don't get at the root issues of the violence that is scaring us all so deeply. So I just name that here because the leadership of CJSF's partners is critical. The leadership of the education justice movement is critical to the kinds of solutions this awful moment and too many awful moments like it before remind us are absolutely imperative. And that I call all of us here in philanthropy into investing in deeply over the long term. Don't in this moment just invest in a policy response. Don't just invest in a narrative strategy. We need to invest in the movement, because as you can imagine, as each of us is shaken, whether we're a public school parent or have children in our families that are in schools, or a spouse or a family member who's a teacher, this impacts us all. And if we are not all well, we are not well. All too often, our eyes and our hearts and our minds are assaulted by the realities that Black children face in schools and in communities. The videos and the headlines that show how they are denied a sense of belonging and safety and physically harmed, but then they're critiqued and studied for not succeeding in the curricula and the testing in the classrooms that continue to model that they're pitted against them. This is the work our partners continue to lead us forward on. And I've offered some horrifying ways of thinking about that, but I'll also say that there's hope. There's hope because our partners continue to forge forward. I'm going to switch to sharing some screens that unpack, to the spirit of Leah's thoughtful question, a little bit about how CJSF seeks to be in that work with our partners. We, as a national collaborative, our strategic priorities are captured here. The first thing that we do is we fund. And so as we think about the place we sit in this nerve center, or as a nerve center or a catalyst, the first thing that we do is we fund. And in 2021, we moved $5.1 million in general operating support to the field of grassroots organizing for education justice. And there's a few things I'd like to say about that. First, I'd like to say thanks to Dennis and his team at Rakes. They are one of our 23 donor members who make this possible. And I think I'll just also note that I think for some of you, you're probably like, that's a lot of money for grassroots organizing. And perhaps other of you are sitting with that's not enough money. And the reality is both of those are true. And we need to do better. And we have fought and we have struggled and we have collaborated to that 2021 new floor of grant making that we have committed to the field. We are going to continue to find a way to sustain and grow for their work and for their efforts. We cannot go back. And we would love to partner with more of you to continue to grow that forward. We have a 64 partner network across 22 states, Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., and Ontario, Canada. They need us to invest in the deep work that is organizing. Organizing, for those of you who are less familiar, and I'm so glad to have such a beautiful, large audience with us here today, it is so much more than I like to say to folks, the standing in front of City Hall, which is a part of what organizing is and always will be and needs to be. But it is that deep coming together in community to build a base based on learning together, that deep political education. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about our second strategy, which is how we contribute to supporting our partners. So in addition to moving general operating multi-year commitments to the field and sustaining those commitments through renewals, even when they're in the ebbs in their organizing that's very public facing, we know those are the moments when they're doing that deep base building, when they're learning and strategizing together. So we stay the course with them. And some of the ways we invite them into the community that we curate on their behalf and in collaboration with them, because of the responsibility that comes with sitting at 15,000 feet and being the receivers of so much information about the brilliance that they are all moving, we seek to be builders. We build with our partners to create connections with them and other power building organizations, to ensure that, yes, they have support for the kinds of organizational strengthening that's critical for organizations that have human power beyond your imagination, but often have budgets that are so much smaller than you might imagine based on the amount of work they're moving and what they're holding for their communities. We need to equalize those realities. And so we provide that very traditional technical assistance and capacity building support. But we also, and I'll name this in this season as an example so I can get close to landing the plane, Leah, being accountable to you and Dennis. We dive deeply into what we can see in the work and what we hear from our friends and others in philanthropy. And so there are a few things I aim for us all in this season. And that, like, one of the primary things is, and I'm going to stop screen sharing because I think I just wanted to give you a little bit of a taste for the visual learners. But a few years ago, after the Parkland tragedy, we were able to kind of stand in the void during the 45th administration when our partners were necessarily very focused on local work and not engaging in federal work. And when the Federal Commission on School Safety was launched, it was very clearly a harmful effort intended to dismantle the work organizers had fought so hard for around acknowledging racial disparities and seeking to make change in the right direction. And so we helped to make sure our partners could be represented in all of the federal listening sessions that were organized with 2 days notice in regional places with no airports and very intentionally designed to be not open to community. And then we collaboratively wrote a report called Do the Harder Work, Create Cultures of Connectedness in Schools. And it includes 10 recommendations we collaboratively wrote with our partners that lifts up what physical safety needs to look and feel like from the perspective of organizers who've been doing this work for so long. So we think of that as our physical safety recommendations. And as we were finishing that, and as the federal government in that season was dismantling the work of the Obama administration and things many of us know a lot about, many of us in philanthropy started to be drawn or had already been drawn to the attraction of the new shiny thing. And I don't mean to diminish its importance. I'll just say, though, that it was presented to many of us in that way of social emotional learning. And we knew that none of our partners, with the exception of one or two, were lifting up campaigns around SEL or anything like that. And we did not expect them to pivot their work to say, like, we want SEL, because we already knew that SEL would very easily become just another way of control and management tactics being used to advance whitewashing of the experiences of children of color in schools around this country. But we also knew its promise. And so we wanted to create a community of practice to lift up the power of organizing as a praxis and to create space for our partners to really be grounded in thinking about and studying together how good SEL actually shows up in their organizing praxis every day. So breaking down the walls of the schoolroom and who is a teacher and helping folks to really internalize to carry into whatever their own campaigns were, what culturally affirming SEL is and how it must extend beyond the right curriculum that a school district buys. We call that our emotional safety work. And we collaboratively did that work with our partners. And now we're in a season, and this is directly connected again to what happened yesterday, to what happened in Buffalo, to the attacks on the lives and well-being of children of so many people around this country, with attacks on CRT, critical race theory, just everything that is happening. We, instead of, and we're grateful to our friends and colleagues who are pushing back or clapping back on those attacks around critical race theory and all that is related to them. But instead of doing a defensive posture, we have created another community of practice, this time to really deeply study with our partners the understanding of culturally sustaining pedagogy. And when I say pedagogy, for those of you who are not experts on education, I mean the how of teaching and learning. We know we need to tackle the what is in our curricula, what are the affirmative visions of self and history that we need to more fully embed, but we also need to look to how is the how of teaching and learning culturally sustaining. And so rather than accepting the literature on that and leaving it that, we're studying it. And again, we're going to look at how it shows up in good organizing praxis. And so that's a lot. It's probably way too much, but these are some of the ways in which we seek to lead. And that's our final strategy, to lead in ways that allow us in philanthropy to enter with the humility of our own need for learning and connection, rather than this idea I think so many of us are held accountable to of needing to be the experts. And we have found it to be so fruitful to lean into the expertise of our partners and them so receptive because we have shown them we will fight hard to resource their work in the beautiful, brilliant ways it deserves to be resourced.
Thank you, Jamie. And I would just underscore a couple of the points that you made. Firstly, just looking at the slide, one of the things that illustrates is this notion of to do systems change work, it is a multifaceted approach. You noted earlier, it's like not just the policy advocacy. Many folks that we're in conversation with equate systems change with change XYZ federal policy, and we know that perhaps is necessary and part of it, but not sufficient. And not the full story of what it takes to get to systems change, that narrative work, that bridging, like part of the phrase grass tops to grassroots was coming to mind as you were describing the research, the contributing to the knowledge base. It is these multifaceted strategies that get at multiple angles of the problem that we're addressing. And so if I were to this won't be a 6-word story, but to summarize how I think about your all's work, it's a multifaceted strategy designed and implemented in collaboration. And, that's too simplistic, but I think highlight some of the core things that I heard. Dennis, let me turn to you as a funder of CJSF and others doing this type of field building towards systems change work. Tell us about why the Raikes Foundation has chosen to pursue and fund and invest in this really messy and hard systems change work, and some of the insights and wisdom that you share having pursued this approach.
Yeah, thank you, Leah. Well, I'll just actually start with some appreciations for Jamie and Leah. You both have been such awesome partners in different ways. Leah, we've done a lot of work, both on our strategy work here at Raikes Foundation with Bridgespan, but also you've been in deep partnership with the ed team here at the Rakes Foundation, just helping us think through some of the mechanisms and capturing the information related to field building. And Jamie, we've been now in a funding relationship since 2018, but I just really want to appreciate the session that your words that you just shared, both about the time that we're in and about the kind of essentialness of community and youth organizing. I've been involved in that work before being in philanthropy, and I deeply believe in it and all the things that you've said. And I know in philanthropy, I think one of the hurdles for folks, particularly national or regional funders, is how do you fund organizing at scale? And I'll say collaborations are a phenomenal way to enter into that. The fact that you all are redistributing those funds throughout the country, and you're doing the hard work of actually being in deep relationship with these organizations and understanding through trust and through time and through shared vision and alignment, sort of where and how the resources should be distributed, and taking the lead from the field around sort of the issues and the content and the pacing and all the things. I just really, at the Rakes Foundation, we love collaborations because this work is far more complicated and far more difficult than any individual foundation can accomplish, irregardless of your size. And actually, the very big foundations that are out there, if not doing this work in collaboration and in deep partnership with the field, can find that they do more harm than good. So I think, that opening question, Leah, like, why do we do this? I don't know there's any better way to do long-term systems change funding than through deep, deep collaboration where you understand the nuances of your role as a grant maker. So I'll share a little bit about one of the sort of collaborations that we're sort of, deeply funding and have been involved with since 2016, actually since well before that, which is the Bell Network. And for those of you that want to geek out while I'm talking, you can go to bellnetwork.org, and there's a whole and information about that network. But I'll just say, so the Rakes Foundation has been funding in education and sort of funding with a centering of young people for a very long time. And when we started our education work, we thought we could fund research on learning mindsets and skills and students' belonging, and then from there fund programs to put that research into practice and to scale it. But we came to understand that the issues in our education system are systemic, actually. And this concept of sort of, fixing the kids, I think, is where a lot of people go wrong, is off. It's not about fixing kids, it's about fixing the systems. And so we needed to turn that on its head. The fact that the system works well for some kids and not well for others isn't going to be solved by just funding programs and hoping to scale in that way. The inequities produced by systems in a design are designed in that way, and therefore sort of research on its own and program scaling on its own is insufficient to redesign these systems. So we realized that we needed to support the growth of fields that was focused on changing the whole system so that it is in service of equity rather than funding discrete programs here and there that might be successful, but that can't fundamentally shift the inequitable foundation of the education system. So we launched the Bell Network in 2016 to, build off of some recent emergence of concepts around the science of learning and development and social and emotional learning that Jamie talked about, and to support school support organizations to better metabolize that information. And, we've been sort of in very deep relationship with a set of anchor organizations, a set of kind of school administrator networks, and at this time, there's about 62 districts across the country that have been, working through a series of tools and research and working in sort of deeper partnership around these concepts about how to support young people to actually belong and feel a sense of belonging within schools. I'd say, you know, in our approach, some things that I think are important. One is like hire experts from the field to lead that work inside your organization. We hired folks like Giselle Shorter, who's now our education director, and has been a practitioner in the ed space for decades. She's also on CJSF's board. And she's an example of somebody who understands the system intimately and has built a lot of trusting relationships, which allows her to identify those field catalysts and to help us be a better guide and partner in how and in what ways we sort of start those investments and start those relationships. I'd say that we are in very deep relationship with this field. Field catalysts may not immediately be obvious, and I think it's very important to take the time to get into deep relationship, find those folks that can be guides to help you understand sort of where to start, and be patient as you do this work. And then I'd say, like, it's important to fund organizations that the field itself trusts. You know, it can be kind of complicated, which is where the importance of, like, you know, taking the time to get to know the partner organizations is really important. There are organizations that are great fundraisers, and there are organizations that are really great at connecting funding to other organizations. There are markers like that to kind of pay attention to. And those folks that the field trusts, that are collaborative, that are sort of movement building versus empire building, those tend to be very good places to start and to go as you get into this work. So I'll stop there. And I know we have a lot of good conversation to go to get into some more detail around all this.
Well, and to lift up one of those points that you were just wrapping with, Dennis, about the work taking time and the relationship building part of it, if the Bell Network had started as like a 3-year grant to these partners to come together and do something, like after 3 years, we would have been like, well, that didn't really work, because it took, I think, the first 2 years was like crunchy, grapply relationship building, like, right? There was this table that came together, and there was space to, like, for the table to breathe and actually sink into trusting relationships, and just the space that the Rakes Foundation created for, and time and patience, all the things that you said, was absolutely necessary. And now, like, oh my goodness, that's the paying of dividends, right? That work is going beyond the actual grants and formal grant making that you've done. It's out living in the field now. A future case study I hope to write. So thank you for that. And Jamie, I will turn back to you and ask you to put Dennis in the hot seat and ask him a hard, illuminating, you know, he loves those kinds of questions. So we'll hand it over to you.
Dennis, Leah said, well, and the great news is I think you did a great job of really laying the groundwork for this question and what you just shared with us all. So I think I'm kind of asking you to pluck out some of the flowers from what you've just planted. But there's a lot of power in philanthropy, and I know we talk about power and power dynamics a lot. For this conversation, for this audience, for you, what would you want us to know about what it means to get uncomfortable and sit with discomfort as we work to build more accountability and philanthropy to grassroots organizations in particular? And, you know, if you want to share a specific example of particularly thoughtful organizing you've seen within or across funder institutions to help us break down that who's an organizer barrier.
Sure. Yeah, getting uncomfortable. It's a great theme for all of us in philanthropy. I guess I would there's a few themes that I think are incredibly important for all grant makers to really hold close to their hearts. One is humility. Even if you came from the field in question, the longer you're in philanthropy, the further you are away from the work on the ground. And there's there's an incredible amount of usefulness to know that you may not have the most recent information, and that the information and the wisdom and the knowledge in the groups on the ground, it may look different than the way you thought about it. And with the power that you have in philanthropy, if it's not coupled with great humility and great curiosity, you may create things that didn't actually need to be created. We have the ability to change gravity, and to sort of bend light, basically, and things that we think should get funded will get funded and will get built, and they may or may not be the right things. And so, there's, I would start with humility. I think clarity of purpose is another important feature of how to do this work and how to be adaptable. Clarity of purpose of you as an individual in philanthropy. When you got into philanthropy, what did you think your purpose was? Remind yourself of that, because things get confusing after a few years. And then I'd say clarity of purpose of the kind of work that you hope to accomplish. If you're clear on the purpose, it allows you to be flexible and adaptable as needed as you learn more and more about the work that's taking place in the world. I'd say be trustworthy and develop trust. There are many ways to do that. I know organizations since the beginning of time have been asking for more general operating funding. When you can get into a deeper relationship and you can just give people that I believe in you money that folks need to innovate, it gives space for their brilliance to really shine. I've done a lot of fundraising in my time. I ran a national network that was a nonprofit. I was a development director. I've launched programs. And I can tell you that when you're in a nonprofit and you're trying to actually get to purpose, if you end up spending all of your time bending yourself into pretzels, trying to kind of pick up small grants here and there, year by year by year, you're completely unable to get completely clear on your purpose and clarity of vision. So we need to fund organizations like we want them to be wildly successful in their work. And that involves being a trusting partner, and it also involves really trusting them. And then I'd say maybe a last point is really think about what is your best role as a funder. And I'll just say at a field level, philanthropy funds a tremendous amount of social change work in this country. And we have a collective identity, I think, as the financiers of social change in this country, but I don't think many of us hold that identity in front of us. We are often tied to the mission of our organization, the accountability of our bosses and our boards. And while that is also quite true, we have to remember that we have a bigger responsibility to try to provide the finance for social change in a way that will allow it to really thrive and be wildly successful. Because what is clear to everybody on this call and everybody we know is that we're in serious times, and everything is coming to a head right now. Evidenced by Texas, Buffalo. I mean, the list is so long, and we all have our own version of it. This work really matters, and the work that you do as grant makers really matters. So let's make sure we're doing it in deep relationship and in deep partnership with others. And there is just a sense of discomfort, I think, when you take that leap of faith to trust in the universe, trust in your partners, trust in the good work. It doesn't mean be blind. I do think that philanthropy has a very important accountability function. And that's hard, actually, because there's power involved with that. Some of us got into philanthropy because we were, trying to fight against what seemed like, power. So what happens when you have it? This field is dizzying in its contradictions. And we still must be using it and improving the tool of philanthropy because it's, like I said, this is where so much social change work is financed. And so we got to do this right. So don't step away from, being a supportive, trusted partner, and also don't step away from raising good questions and holding people, accountable to their missions and purposes. Both have to be true, and that's uncomfortable because it's not clear. But I think those types of contradictions, we all sit with them. And those are the things that we need to really hold close as we try to be better and better at our work.
Thank you for that question, Jamie, and that response, Dennis. And Dennis, in a moment, I will turn to you to ask your hard question of Jamie. But did want to draw something out from the comments that you just made around just power, relationships, a lot of the themes that you named. And we have gotten the feedback as folks, funders in particular, have read our research, like, sure, this is all great. Okay, system change, we're hearing about that. It's so hard to measure. How do you know if it's working? This question manifests as a measurement question. My 2 cents and my lens on that is it's actually not a measurement question. It's a question about who you trust and what success actually means and looks like. And from the funders that we have gotten to interview and study who are doing this work, like you all at the Race Foundation, that measurement question actually isn't a barrier to doing this work. It doesn't present that way because in relationship with folks like Jamie and others doing the work, you have a shared view of what you're trying to do and of what, quote, success looks like. And you're comfortable with intermediate, mile markers along the way. And so I named that as, I don't know if for those in the audience are thinking, but how do you know if it's working? How do we measure this? I think our measurement paradigm is broken. And if that's where we're going, is like naming that as a barrier to doing this work. Well, let's tackle that, but also get to some of the deeper things behind that question. And Dennis, I think what you just said about power and relationships and trust is so much, the antidote. Thank you for all of that. And I will say, and it's hard, and it is not the prevailing paradigm. So being real about that and what it will take to change as well. Dennis, you have a question for Jamie.
Your turn for the hot seat, Jamie. I just talked a bit about kind of the power that you have in philanthropy, and sort of from my perspective, kind of what it means to build partnership. And I'm curious, from your perspective and the work that you do, you are both a fundraiser and a grant maker. You sit in this very interesting space in between those different, functions. There's a way that I imagine that you do this. And I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit for us, as a sort of nerve center organization, what do you do when you see something in the fields from your vantage point, but other groups are missing it? How do you think about the power that you hold, given your role in the fields? And, how should a funder funding infrastructure and intermediary capacity think about when is there enough infrastructure and when should you be funding groups beyond the infrastructure? So want to just take that in any direction you want to go.
Thank you for these great questions. I'll start with the question around what do you do when you see something that maybe others are missing, and just say there's kind of a set of questions I hold in my own head for those moments, and they're pretty basic questions, but it's about really like starting with what do I and what do we as a team believe is the action that's really called for and by whom, just to kind of ground ourselves in like what is the what and who do we believe might be called into the response, just as a place for accountability around like what is that analysis and why. Also considering like, is this urgent Or does it just require attention, or neither? And who needs to know? Right. So all of the things that are about making sure that the circle of consideration is as big or as small as it needs to be, based on something that needs to happen or isn't happening or folks are not focused on. So I'll point back to the example just briefly of like the Federal Commission on School Safety, where we knew that organizers needed to be a part of that conversation. We knew that we weren't going to apologize for being like, we can see something we know you don't have the capacity to hold. And then rather than saying to them, what are you going to do about it? We sat in this 15,000 foot seat and said, oh, we are positioned to help hold, with all of the knowledge we have the privilege of holding about their work, the invitation to trust, to say, would you like to be a part of this? And if not, that's fine too. But then the other part of this is, do folks need resources to do this work? And who can offer those resources? So at CJSF, we talk a lot about both and fundraising, right? Our own kind of internal metrics of success are not just the bar chart I showed you earlier in the conversation of our direct grant making to the field. It's also what we don't really track incredibly formally on a regular basis, but seek to always hold informally in our knowledge base, which is that how have we made connections to the field that result in direct relationships between philanthropy and other actors and the field that are producing the resources those groups need, so that we're not kind of gatekeeping the funding relationships. And so in this idea of like, what do you do when you see something that's missing? That's the kind of, those are the moments oftentimes that crystallize relationships that may not be at the like center of the response of the moment, but we've seen some of the most important, I think, funder partner relationships emerge from that. Let's respond to this together, right? So we are really playing that role of dot connector rather than gatekeeper. I just want to bring the word abundance into this piece of the answer too, and just say, right, we have to acknowledge that in the moments when things are tough, that if we embrace this spirit of abundance and we really think about who are the folks who can play the different roles, again, from where we sit in the ecosystem, we're particularly well placed to think about who can we call in order to embrace the abundance of the moment. And abundance is not always about like goodness and joy. And I just want to name that as well. So, you know, when I get off this call, I'll be convening with comrades and friends in this movement to think about a space for healing and grieving together for the movement that will have nothing to do with policy, with strategy, or with tactics. It will just have to do with breathing and with being together and crying and raging. And then from there, when we have done enough cleansing of our hearts to take a breath, then we can talk about strategy and action. And for me, that's one of the ways you define abundance. And, you know, so I think one of the questions you asked also was about kind of wielding power, Dennis. So I'll shift there and just say, you know, there's a few things I would want this audience to know about how CJSF does that work. And, you know, the place that power shows up the most directly and where I feel personally the most accountability is around our grant making. And so there is a reality that our donor members, when we got started, and I'll bring our beloved ancestor, my sister and now ancestor, Allison Brown. Sorry, I hope you can see her there on my blurred screen. She sits with me here every day and in my heart. She called me into philanthropy, kicking and screaming, but she called me in, and we lost her in 2020, but her legacy and vision for this work is central to how we move today. And that legacy and vision was so many things, but I'll name one or two here. And one of those was our donor members joined Allison willingly on the journey when she said at the beginning of her leadership tenure, this organization is going to be about dismantling anti-Blackness in systems and in communities. Are you with us? And our members have been with us fully and wholly. And that is why we've been able to do this work of wielding power thoughtfully. And the second thing is, she said to our members, and let's not waste our time having you review a grant slate. Do you trust us? Do you trust us to hold that for us? And so that is how we do it. And what I would name for you is we do 2-year cycles of grant making because that's what we can fundraise outwards to comfortably. As soon as we feel comfortable stretching to 3 years, we will stretch to 3 years. And so the staff of this little organization, we hold the power and the responsibility of those funding relationships. And yes, you can think of them in 2-year cycles, but we think of them as the long term. We're just moving the money in 2-year tranches because, again, that's what we can fundraise for. But our commitment to the field is long term. And so there are partners who cycle out occasionally because they fully stepped away from education justice organizing or something like that. But just generally speaking, we seek to live into the value of funding over the long term, and we bring new partners in through recommendations from members sometimes. And Zoe at Rakes just recommended a partner who we are really excited to be able to fund. And that partner has also been recommended to us by a number of our partners. But we use our rapid response pot of money that we set aside every year as a way for folks to kind of maybe unknowingly, candidly, participate participatorily, since that's something we all love in this sector, in the grant making by being able to say, hey, we're in the work with this organization and they need resources in this moment for something. And we're encouraging you to resource that. And we, by doing that through our rapid response resources, invite that organization into our partner network. And that allows them to build with us and us to build with them until we arrive at a place where we know we can make a funding commitment that is aligned with that value I keep stating of the long-term investments. And so as we increase the resources we have available for the field, we're slowly growing without ever opening an open call for proposals that creates competition. The invitations to those folks who've been joining us in this learning journey and in this striving together to join that general operating support grantee partner network that they originally joined through rapid response recommendations that came from partners or members. And, you know, on the question of like in capacity, because I think you also touched upon that, Dennis, you know, sometimes it's like the question around like, when is there enough or when is there not enough? I just want to like, you know, with so much gratitude to be in this conversation, just say for organizers, we're just not, that question doesn't matter yet, because the reality is the question is, when is there not enough? And there's just not enough money being moved to social justice organizing generally, but to racial justice and education in particular. And to my education funder peeps, I will just say we have to do better. We have to stretch beyond equity to justice. They are distinctly different. Our friends at SHOT have done a thoughtful job of mapping that out. We need to reach to justice, and we need to move general operating support to that work. And then we can talk about when there is enough. And I still co-sign, Dennis, on your thoughtful, I forget the way you say it, but you know, field building versus empire building. There is not an empire in education justice. And so let's get to that question when we have that beautiful problem. So thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Let me pause here. We have about 10 minutes left in this session, and I will give you all 3 options. 4 options. 1, just sit and take a breath and soak in all of the insights and wisdoms and stories and just really incredible, inspiring work that Jamie and Dennis are leading. Option 2 is, there's a burning question on your mind, type it in the chat. Option 3 is put that question in the Slido Q&A. I know it's confusing with technology to have multiple options. I have both open, so I'll find your question. And option 4, sometimes it's nice to have a new voice in the space. So I'm going to go into gallery mode. And if anyone comes off mute and wants to verbally bring your question into the space, you are welcome to do that. Let's take a moment, type in your question, come off mute and ask it, or just sit and continue to soak it all in. I don't think I see anyone coming off mute. Maybe I should have actually said raise your hand so I could call on you, because it's actually hard to be scanning all these boxes. If you're off mute, clear your throat. I don't think anyone came off mute though. There was a question brought into the space last week that I thought led to just some really relevant lines of inquiry, Dennis, for both you and Jamie. That was about what to do, and you touched on some of this, but what to do in this moment of feeling such polarization in so many meanings of that word. And we're talking about collaborative work, we're talking about coalitions, we're talking about coming together. And so there's one level of that, which is like ideological, but I thought like the level below that, which was really interesting, that was brought into the room last week, was what if different partners have just different theories of change, or like different ways that they think this system change we're talking about will happen, even with that shared North Star, same goal, you know, all of that. And so curious for both of you just to reflect for a moment at whatever altitude you want to take that question, but we are, you know, you are both working in spaces where there isn't just obvious alignment on the three priorities, right? And if there were, that probably wouldn't really be authentic alignment, knowing what we know about this work and how hard it is. So would either of you like to share some thoughts and advice and encouragement? Because that is one of the messier parts of doing this type of work.
Sure, I'll just sort of off the top of my head say a few things. You know, I think, let's see. I think that there's a lot of conversation that seeks to make general statements and reduce things down to sort of simple black and white choices around, you know, whether it's strategy or paths forward, or what it means to be in the fight for racial justice. And on the one hand, that's incredibly helpful because it's accessible. And on the other hand, I think we all know that there's a lot of nuance. And I think that trying to create spaces where you can have generative debate and discussion and disagreement is essential. I don't think that we have figured it out. I think that at a values level, at an understanding of sort of structural barriers level, yeah, I think there's some brilliance out there that needs to go farther and faster. But I don't think that at the end of the day, we have figured it all out, and that there are multiple ways to get to an end result. So, you know, what I appreciate when I'm in kind of collaborative spaces is normalizing debate without it becoming a personalization, but really a discussion of whether it's strategy or choices or something else. Take it at face value. And I think that it is hard to really drop into partnership if you can't trust that you can debate and disagree and still come back to your shared alignment, your shared values, your shared humanity, and the bigger purpose. And I think it, you know, there's a lot of work now that is sort of being led by folks like John Powell and others around belonging. And I think that's actually really, really important. I think we are both in the fight of our lives, and we all need to be clear around when it's a political fight, and we are in a time where we need to see each other as humans, and have a bit more faith and grace and trust in others, to at least engage. And it could be wide gaps, it could be narrow gaps of disagreement. But I do really think that, you know, we seem to have forgotten how to have generative debate and discussion that can transform our own ideas about a path forward. And so I would just, you know, I would start with that. Jamie, I don't know if you want to add anything on that one.
Yeah, I'm chuckling as you not in a like haha way, but just as I think about like how that shows up in my own household. So like I took a headshot in the woods across the street from my house and I was like, oh, I look great. And then my 13-year-old was like, why are you wearing lipstick in the woods? So and I just bring that to say like our different perspectives on the world make us stronger. And so just to like co-signing on what you said about generative conversations, Dennis, and just reminding us all that like what we hold as the mantle of responsibility and philanthropy. And I have no doubt that everyone showing up to GEO kind of has a general kind of way they move with this in the world. But I think I know I need to be reminded of it. The weight of the power that we hold comes with responsibility. So in those generative conversations, did we convene them? And are we committed to stretching ourselves to actually act upon the vision of those who are stretching us to the most uncomfortable places? Because I actually think that that is really important, that even if we have to acknowledge we won't come to consensus and we shouldn't agree to things we don't actually fundamentally agree with until we're comfortable with them. I have seen such incredible power in the way CJSF donor members show up at the table for learning and conversation and flex to continue to leave uncomfortably because we've said, let's trust the movement. And that doesn't always equip you all, our members, to be able to carry that work to your boards or to all of but we're doing that work together to be uncomfortable. So when we create the spaces for learning and conversation, I think we're stronger. So just co-signing. And then the other piece I would add to that, because I think sometimes we come together and we're only looking for the narrative messaging, the narrative strategy. And so just bringing this idea of narrative power building as something that needs to be resourced that's directly related to the conversation, right? Generative conversation that expands outward and can flourish and blossom because it's in more of the mainstream space requires us in philanthropy to really acknowledge that too often we're coming to our partners for the right message in a moment and not deeply resourcing or not resourcing at all the work for them to really be able to build narrative power that is the connective tissue across their political education and base building work and the demands that they advance in campaigns publicly every day. So that would be the other piece I'd offer as a call.
Thank you, Jamie. I love what you just said about that first point about go where we're being stretched the furthest. That is what it will take to actually, we hear this word proximity a lot. What does it actually mean? Listen to those most proximate to the problem. And they, in my experience at least, those voices are pushing us the furthest. So it's not a lowest common denominator approach to collaboration. What can we all agree on? That makes the work so small. That abundance mindset takes us to like, how can we stretch the furthest? Because that's where we need to go. So thank you. Gosh, you all have blessed my time this morning. So much gratitude. I started by crying. I'm gonna end by crying. Thank you. Leo, folks, back to you. Thanks for having us here today.
Oh, thank you, Leah, Dennis, and Jamie, so much for being with us this morning. This was an absolutely wonderful session. I appreciate you all making the space and sharing your wonderful resources, knowledge, expertise, and just being present with us. Can't express enough gratitude. Everyone, Allison is going to drop a link in the chat if you wouldn't mind giving us feedback on this session. And Dennis, I know Leah and Jamie would also appreciate that. So if you wouldn't mind giving us your evals, we're going to go into break. So take some breathers, take care of yourself, take a walk. Jamie, actually, if you wouldn't mind dropping that meditation back in the chat from earlier. Jamie shared a really lovely meditation if anybody needs like it's just 6 minutes for reflection. Jamie's going to share that as well, but we will be back for our next session at 1:15 Eastern time, 12:15 Central, 11:15 Mountain, 10:15 Pacific. We look forward to seeing you then. Enjoy your break. And again, please join me in thanking Leah, Dennis, and Jamie. Thank you all.